Hi, my name is Ryan Garmo, and welcome to Jazz Stuff. Today, we'll be talking about organizational theory in jazz music. First, we'll start with a discussion of top-down hierarchy, a musical parallel for this type of organizational structure, and then some problems associated with top-down hierarchy. Then, we'll move on to a conversation of jazz music as it relates to these same concepts. An organizational theory is an interrelated set of concepts and constructs that describe how humans behave in social units that we like to call organizations. Essentially, organizational theory explains how humans do stuff in groups. Traditional models of organizations look like this. We'll call this top-down hierarchy. Top-down hierarchy is generally characterized by a single leader or entity at the top of the organization, which then makes unilateral decisions about the trajectory and decisions for the organization. Along these lines, decisions are then passed down the pyramid to decreasingly powerful people. Top-down hierarchy was the format for monarchies back in the day and has parallels to our government in the United States right now. For example, we have our federal government, which then delegates down to state governments, which then delegates down to local governments. A musical parallel for top-down hierarchy could be the symphony orchestra. The symphony orchestra is led by a single conductor who generally has ultimate decision-making power in terms of repertoire, artistic vision, personnel, and general artistic trajectory of the organization. Below the director is middle management, which in this case could be compared to principal players, such as first violin or principal trumpet. These middle managers are then responsible for delegating information to their sections, second trumpet, second violin. This analogy continues further when you consider the type of music that is generally played by symphony orchestras. Most of the time, symphonic music will be written out with very specific instructions. The role of middle management and staff then is to perform very precisely what is put in front of them by leadership. Of course, this music is of the highest difficulty and requires years and years of dedicated practice to perform well. However, similar to many corporate settings, autonomy is generally reserved for the people at the top of the pyramid. Now, there are a host of problems associated with this type of organizational structure. First, decision-making power held by a singular entity or person presents a host of problems. According to Stanford business professor Lyndred Greer, leaders will talk 80% of the time during a meeting, leaving 20% of contributions to come from non-leaders. From this perspective, singular leadership discourages conversation and opposing viewpoints. Furthermore, Greer's studies have also shown that leaders are not necessarily chosen on their intelligence nor their ability to lead. In an undergraduate course, Greer tasked her students with choosing a leader to lead them out of a theoretical desert. No one knows what a theoretical desert is. Researchers found that about 50% of the students chose a leader not based on their ability to lead or their overall intelligence, but on arbitrary factors such as height, gender, depth of voice, or attractiveness. The second problem is that these types of organizations are slow. Because decisions come from a concentrated point at the top, it takes a while for them to trickle down to the people actually doing the work. Many times, the way management wants things done is actually different than the best way to do them. This not only creates a delay in getting the work done, but also creates an animosity between staff and management. There are potential consequences when information flows in one direction. The third problem is that these organizations are rigid. As organizations become more complex, it is necessary that they create more designations and structures within their organization to help keep things running smoothly. However, this can result in strict job designations and a pressure to recreate past successes that squelch the creativity of their employees. This creates a system where employees don't necessarily know how to solve problems outside of being told what to do. So, what is the musical alternative to top-down hierarchy? It's jazz. It's jazz. Get that? It's jazz. That's why we're here. If jazz had an organizational chart, it would look something like this. At first glance, we can see that the jazz organizational chart is not necessarily a pyramid, but more a circle where all the dots are connected to one another. This graph exemplifies the concept of shared leadership. As you can see, there is no singular point of leadership at the top of a pyramid in the jazz organizational structure. In jazz, the musicians rotate leadership based off who is soloing and who is accompanying. At any point, any musician in the ensemble can be a leader, where everyone else is then expected to respond and to react what the leader is doing in that moment. This interconnectedness has potential to create new ideas and systems because all of the organization's knowledge and skills are made aware of and used in the organization's functioning. Not only is this an alternative model of leadership, it suggests an alternative model of followership. The vehicle for shared leadership is improvisation. Of course, many people would know that improvisation is a key cornerstone of jazz music. However, there are certain characteristics of jazz music that suggest an ideal for how humans might organize themselves in groups. We'll discuss 3 attributes of jazz improvisation, corroborated from Frank J. Barrett's article. Creativity, improvisation in jazz and organizations, implications for organizational learning. The first attribute of jazz improvisation that we'll discuss is bypassing habits. Barrett suggests that jazz musicians guard against the temptation to repeat stock phrases or ideas in their improvisation. Repeating these ideas actually is contradictory to the goal of improvisation in the first place. From an organizational perspective, this approach of improvisation runs contrary to the competency trap. The competency trap is the tendency for an organization to get stuck in its similar routines. Just because a routine was successful does not mean that it's going to be successful forever, or that it should be executed the same way forever and ever. These types of routines squelch experimentation. The second characteristic of jazz improvisation is the embracing of errors. If past successes create routines that minimize errors, then errors take on a negative connotation. However, errors can actually be a great source of learning. Famous bebop drummer Max Roach once said, "If 2 players make a mistake and end up in the wrong place at the wrong time, they may be able to break out of it and get into something else they might not have discovered otherwise." This implies a relationship to errors that is not negative or detrimental, but one where errors are actually embraced. Errors are then a valuable and integrated part into the creative process. As jazz musicians strive for new heights in improvisation, errors or unintended outcomes are bound to happen. What if this mindset was applied to organizations? Often, organizations seek to minimize or potentially even erase errors altogether in their processes. This can immobilize and sterilize their people. Our final attribute of jazz improvisation, as it relates to organizational theory, is the concept of minimum structures which allow maximum flexibility. In an effort to guarantee consistency and efficiency, organizations will often implement standard operating procedures. These standard operating procedures aim to avoid changes in ambiguity through establishing clear rational goals and forms of centralized control. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with these types of procedures. In fact, I'm sure many of us have found these concepts to be effective in our own organizations and personal lives. However, jazz improvisation implies a different model. In jazz, activity is loosely based around a common song, which has an agreed upon melody, chord structure, and form. The selection of standard tunes and chord changes offer a minimum base for jazz musicians to base their performance. The rules are agreed upon beforehand, but then any departures within the actual execution of the processes are up to the musicians in the moment. If jazz had standard operating procedures, it would go the same way every single time. However, from this common launching pad of agreed upon song structures, melodies, chords, jazz musicians are free to innovate on the fly and create something completely new every single time. There's no need to check with leadership on what's going on. Everyone has a baseline understanding of what is happening, and therefore is free to create and collaborate with each other on the fly. This video is not to say that top-down hierarchy, or examples of it, are bad. We can all think of 10 counterexamples of organizations that do great work in the world that exhibit top-down hierarchy. However, jazz does present a convincing model for an alternative organizational structure. Which model would lead to more innovation? Which model is more efficient? Which model most meaningfully integrates the knowledge and skills of all parties of the organization? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.